The quiet was the very first thing that struck you. Not the silence of a graveyard, but that profound, suffocating stillness that descends upon a place where a terrible truth has been buried alive. It was the silence of a house that had swallowed a secret whole, slowly digesting it across decades until the very timber in the walls groaned beneath its burden. And within that stillness, a question lingered, a whisper that no soul dared give voice to, yet every soul could feel pressing against their ribs. Why him? Why, out of all the men and women toiling beneath the merciless Virginia sun, was one young man lifted from the fields and carried into the master's house? The answer was never spoken. It was never recorded. It was never even hinted at in the guarded conversations that took place behind sealed doors. It was a choice made in the sweltering grip of an antebellum summer, a decision that would unravel an entire family, expose a legacy built upon crumbling sand, and alter forever the life of Elias, the chosen one. His story is not one of freedom, nor of simple servitude. It is the story of a man compelled to live inside the very beating heart of a lie, where the air ran thick with unspoken histories, and the shadows held more truth than the light ever could. And as you step into that suffocating intimacy alongside him, you will find yourself asking, as Elias did every waking hour, what unspeakable truth could drive a master to make such a choice, and why, to this very day, the reason was never written down. Before we continue walking through Elias's story, if you are new here, welcome to Black Right Stories. Subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Which country? The year was 1847, and the air hanging over Prince Edward County, Virginia, was thick and humid, heavy with the perfume of ripening tobacco and the unspoken weight of generations. The Hatcher Plantation, known to all as Oakwood, stretched across nearly 2,000 acres, its fields a vast patchwork of green and brown, rolling toward the horizon, broken only by the dark, brooding tree line of distant woods. At its center stood the main house, a commanding two-story structure of whitewashed brick, its columns rising like silent sentinels, its windows gazing outward with an almost mournful dignity. It was a house erected upon ambition, upon the labor of enslaved hands, and upon that particular brand of Southern pride that has always served as a veil for a multitude of sins. For generations, Oakwood had stood as a pillar of the county. Its master, Edmund Hatcher, was a figure of formidable presence, his name woven into the fabric of the region's identity, synonymous with prosperity and an iron will. He was a man whose gaze alone could diminish a lesser soul, whose voice, though seldom raised, carried the full gravity of absolute authority. Yet even in the years of his prime, there had always been a particular gauntness to his features, a shadow residing deep behind his eyes that whispered of a more personal torment, something gnawing at him from within. Now at 58, a widower for nearly a decade, that shadow had deepened considerably, etching lines of exhaustion and something very close to despair around the corners of his mouth. He moved through his grand house like a ghost. His presence felt more than seen, a brooding and silent force that permeated every corner of Oakwood. Elias, at 22, knew only the fields. His world had been shaped entirely by the rhythmic swing of the hoe, the sharp and bitter smell of tobacco leaves, the relentless sun pressing down against the back of his neck, and the quiet camaraderie of shared suffering in the slave quarters. He was a man of lean, quiet strength, his frame hardened by years of labor, his hands calloused, his face carrying the early markings of a life lived under continuous strain. But beneath all of that, Elias possessed an intelligence that set him apart from those around him, a sharp and observant mind that absorbed every detail, catalogued every nuance, filed away every fragment of the world it encountered. He listened far more than he spoke, his dark eyes missing nothing. His mother, Nora, had been a field slave, a woman of quiet dignity and fierce, enduring love, who had passed when Elias was just 12 years old, leaving him with little more than a fading memory of her gentle hands and the persistent ache of her absence. He carried her stories with him always, tales she had whispered late at night in the cramped cabin, stories of resilience and cautious hope, but also of the brutal and unchanging realities of their existence. Her death had not broken him. It had instead forged him into something quieter and harder, not bitter, but resolute, determined to survive, to endure, to remain unbroken beneath whatever the world chose to deliver. His closest companion in the quarters was a man named Abner, an elder slave, perhaps 60 years of age, whose skin resembled worn leather and whose eyes held the accumulated wisdom of countless seasons. Abner had seen generations arrive and depart. He had witnessed the rise and fall of masters and had come to understand the intricate and often brutal choreography between power and submission. He was a quiet man as well, but his silence was of a different kind, the silence of someone who had learned long ago that words, when spoken carelessly, could become weapons turned against the speaker. He shared his understanding through parables, through knowing glances, through subtle shifts in posture that communicated volumes without a single syllable. After Nora's passing, Abner had taken Elias under his watch, teaching him the rhythms of the land, the unspoken laws of survival, and above all else, the critical importance of keeping one's own counsel. Elias had absorbed every lesson with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. Life in the quarters stood in stark relief against the grandeur of the main house. The cabins, crude and functional, gathered together in a cluster near the back of the property, their dirt floors swept clean each morning, their meager possessions arranged with careful intention. The air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke, cooking greens, and the closeness of many bodies, punctuated by the sound of children's laughter, low murmured conversation, and the occasional mournful spiritual sung softly as the sun sank below the trees. It was a world entire unto itself, separate from, and yet inextricably tied to, the house on the hill. Elias moved through it with a quiet, steady grace. He was one of them, a field hand destined for a life of unending labor, his future as predictable as the turning of the seasons. He had accepted this not with resignation, but with the quiet strength of a man who understood the limits of his world and had chosen to build his dignity within them. He had no illusions, no grand dreams of escape, only the daily work of surviving with his humanity intact. His inner life, though rich and carefully observed, was guarded like treasure. It was his sanctuary against the relentless hardness of everything outside it. The idea that this carefully arranged normalcy, this predictable rhythm, was about to be shattered would have seemed to him nothing short of impossible. Yet the unseen currents of fate, moved by the dark and unspoken needs of a powerful man, were already gathering around him, preparing to pull him from the familiar earth and deposit him inside the suffocating gilded cage of the master's house. The day the world shifted for Elias began the way all days began, beneath a sky of relentless, cloudless blue. The sun pressed down with an almost cruel intensity, baking the earth beneath their feet and drawing beads of sweat from every brow. The air shimmered above the rows of tobacco plants, and the rhythmic thud of hose against soil was the only sound bold enough to compete with the buzzing of the cicadas. Elias was deep in the rows, his back aching, his muscles burning steadily, his mind settled into that meditative state born of long repetition. He moved with the efficiency of a man who has performed the same motions 10,000 times, his eyes scanning the broad green leaves for signs of pest or blight, his hands moving with practiced precision. Then a ripple passed through the field. A hush descended, not sudden but gradual, like a wave drawing back from the shore. Heads began to turn, slowly and carefully, toward the far edge of the field where the path from the main house met the cultivated land. Elias sensed the shift before he understood it, and he paused, his hoe resting against his shoulder. His gaze followed the others, and his breath caught. Standing at the boundary between their world and the master's stood Edmund Hatcher. Beside him was Thomas Hatcher, his son, a man of 30 whose face had already been shaped by petulance and inherited authority into something permanently hard. Thomas managed the daily operations of the plantation. His presence in the fields usually signaled a sharp tongue or a swift punishment. But today his expression was not anger. It was something closer to barely contained displeasure, a tight, bloodless line where his mouth should have been. Behin, Deetham. The field foreman, Mr. Davies, stood at a respectful distance, his usual bluster replaced by an uncharacteristic stillness. Edmund Hatcher was the center of it all. He stood tall in spite of his age, his posture still commanding, though his shoulders seemed bent beneath some invisible load. He wore a linen suit of immaculate white, a stark apparition against the dust and earth of the field. His eyes, which usually fixed themselves on some distant and unseen point, now swept slowly across the rows of enslaved men and women. A deliberate, unnerving survey. The silence deepened until it became almost unbearable. Every man and woman in that field understood what they were witnessing. When the master came to the fields, it was never without a purpose. Edmund's gaze slowed. It lingered. And then, with a slow and deliberate movement, his arm rose, his index finger extending outward, pointing not at a problem in the crop, not at a particular task, but directly at Elias. A cold dread moved through Elias like groundwater. He stood completely still, his hoe motionless, his eyes wide, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He looked to the left and to the right, half expecting the finger to shift, to find someone else, anyone else, but it did not move. Mr. Davies stepped forward, his voice low and uncertain. "Master Hatcher, is there some trouble with Elias's work?" Edmund did not lower his arm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper, yet it carried across that silent field with an unnerving clarity. "No trouble, Davies. Elias, you are to come with me. You will work in the house from this day forward." No explanation, no reasoning offered. Just a decree delivered with the finality of something carved in stone. Thomas shifted where he stood, a low sound escaping his throat. "Father, with respect, Elias is a field hand. He has no experience. Irons in the house. We have Ruth and the others perfectly capable." Edmund's eyes, sharp and cold as flint, cut him off. "My decision, Thomas. It is made." Thomas fell silent, his face a rigid mask of barely leashed fury. The other hands remained motionless, their expressions unreadable. But Elias felt the full weight of their collective gaze settle upon him. Not the weight of surprise, but of something far older. Something that knew, in the marrow of its knowledge, that to be chosen without explanation was rarely any kind of blessing. They understood what he was walking toward, and their silence contained within it both a warning and a kind of grief. Elias slowly lowered his hoe to the red earth. His legs felt heavy. He drew a long, unsteady breath, the air tasting suddenly strange in his mouth, metallic and close. He found Abner's face in the rows, the old man standing perfectly still, his expression a studied calm. But in Abner's eyes, unmistakable, was a deep and genuine alarm. "Come, Elias," Edmund said. His voice had dropped further still, softer now, almost coaxing, a tone Elias had never heard directed at him. It was somehow more unsettling than any command had ever been. Elias walked. His steps were stiff, his mind turning rapidly and arriving nowhere. He left behind the familiar smell of tobacco and red dust, the steadying rhythm of shared labor, and moved toward the imposing figure of the master and the grand house that had always existed for him as a distant and untouchable thing. As he passed Thomas, he felt the younger man's gaze like a hand pressed against his chest, a palpable wall of resentment that carried within it a clear and unspoken promise of future reckoning. The walk to the house passed in a kind of blur. The sounds of the field fell away behind him. The crunch of gravel replaced them, then the rustle of manicured hedges, then the deep, articulate quiet of the master's domain. He was led through a side entrance into the cool and shadowed interior, a place he had glimpsed only ever from a respectful distance. The air inside was different, cooler, heavier, scented with beeswax, old paper, and something else that had no easy name. Something that spoke of long-held secrets and histories that had never been permitted to breathe. Ruth, a house slave in her mid-30s, met them in the back corridor. Her face held a carefully arranged expression, apprehension and a guarded kind of sympathy existing side by side. She had worked inside the house for years. Her movements were quiet and precise, her eyes long accustomed to absorbing everything while appearing to register nothing. "Ruth," Edmund said, his voice echoing faintly in the hushed hallway, "show Elias to his room. He will attend me personally. See that he understands his duties." Her gaze met Elias's for only a moment, a brief, silent exchange of shared understanding, a warning communicated without words. She led him down a narrow corridor, dimly lit, away from the grander rooms and toward the back of the house. Each floorboard gave a soft complaint beneath their feet, each sound amplified in the pressing quiet. His room was barely more than a closet, tucked off the back corridor, just steps from the master's private study. Inside, a narrow cot, a small wooden chest, a single high window offering a sliver of pale sky, clean, spare, and completely devoid of anything personal. A space built for availability, not rest. A space that said, in its very plainness, that the person sleeping there was meant to be close, always close, but never quite present. "This is where you sleep," Ruth whispered, her voice barely above breath. "You're just steps from the master's study. He likes to be able to call on you at any hour." Her eyes, he LD'd a deep, unsettling knowledge. "You listen, you learn, you keep your mouth shut, and you watch." Elias nodded. His throat was too tight for words. He looked around the small room and felt the walls press inward. That first night was a sustained torment. The sounds of the house were alien to him, magnified and strange in the darkness. Floorboards complaining somewhere above him. The distant toll of a grandfather clock, leaves brushing against the window glass, the soft, indistinct movement of voices from other parts of the house. He lay rigid on the cot, his mind turning the same questions over and over, arriving nowhere. He felt like something captured, a creature placed inside an enclosure whose bars he could not see but could feel at every edge of the space around him. The house pressed against him like a living thing, breathing and aware, dense with things that had never been said aloud. And then, through the wall of the master's study directly beside him, he heard it, a soft, barely perceptible sound. A long exhale, the faint clink of glass, and then a silence so deliberate it felt like a presence of its own. Elias lay still and understood with a cold certainty that Edmund Hatcher was awake on the other side of that wall. Awake and not, he sensed, entirely alone in his thoughts. The nature of the attention being paid to him in that house, attention without name, without category, pressed against him in the dark. And the reason for his selection remained a void, a hollow space at the center of everything, mocking his need to understand. The weeks that followed blurred into months, each day a slow and careful unraveling of the life Elias had known. He learned the house with the same quiet thoroughness he had always brought to learning, its rhythms and its geography, the boards that cried out underfoot, and the drafts that moved through certain corridors like hissiped reminders, the way light shifted through the tall windows as the hours turned. He learnt its smells, the faint sweetness of cut flowers left too long in the parlor vase, the sharp bite of lemon polish, the musty depth of unread books in the library, and beneath all of it, always, the heavy aromatic drift of Edmund Hatcher's pipe tobacco. His primary duties were personal attendance upon the master, laying out his clothes in the morning, preparing his tea, serving his meals in the dining room, and most frequently maintaining his private study. He became a shadow in that house, present in every room, registered by no one. The emotional geography of Oakwood proved to be its own kind of terrain, as treacherous and shifting as any wilderness. Clara Hatcher, Edmund's daughter, 24 years old, moved through the house with a quiet grace that seemed inseparable from a profound and settled sadness. She was often discovered sitting near a window in the morning with a book open across her lap, though she rarely appeared to be reading it. Her education, unusual for a woman of her station and era, seemed only to have deepened her unhappiness, sharpening her perception of the cage she inhabited. She would sometimes offer Elias a small, barely visible acknowledgement as he passed, a slight nod, a fractional turn of the eyes. It was always accompanied by a look of profound and unguarded pity, as if she saw in his situation an uncomfortable reflection of her own. Thomas, by contrast, made no effort whatsoever to conceal his hostility. His cruelties, once dispersed broadly across the plantation, now had a sharper, more focused target. He invented reasons to find fault. He issued contradictory instructions and then criticized the outcomes. He would simply stand in doorways and watch Elias with a cold and calculating hatred. The hatred not of a man who had been wrong, but of a man who fears that a wrong is being committed somewhere nearby, one he cannot yet name or prove. His eyes, when they found Elias's, always carried within them a particular calculation, as though he were solving for a variable whose answer frightened him. Mrs. Dorothea Price, the housekeeper, had served the Hatcher family for more than 20 years. She was a woman of formidable self-possession, her face a cartography of carefully held expressions, her eyes sharp and perpetually guarded. She communicated her instructions with precision and her warnings in clipped, elliptical phrases that pointed toward deeper waters without ever diving into them. She was clearly a keeper of this house's most closely held knowledge, and she watched Elias, not with hostility but with a strange compound of suspicion and something that resembled, though she would never have allowed herself to call it that, concern. But it was Edmund Hatcher who remained the true axis around which everything in that house quietly turned. Each night, without exception, Edmund would retreat to his private study, draw the heavy oak door closed behind him, and lock it. From behind that door would come the soft, measured sounds of a man sitting alone with his burdens, the clink of glass, a long and labored exhale, the occasional low shift of his chair. On the wall above the fireplace in that study hung a portrait. A woman. Her features were soft and strong at once, her eyes possessing a luminous quality that seemed to follow whoever stood beneath them. She was beautiful, dressed simply, her dark hair drawn back from a high forehead. No one in the house ever spoke her name. She was simply the portrait, and Edmund would sit before it in the evenings, his face unguarded in a way it never was by daylight, raw with a grief so old it had become part of his architecture. Most disturbing of all was the gaze. Edmund would sometimes stop mid-sentence, mid-thought, and let his eyes settle on Elias with a searching, almost compulsive intensity. It was not the gaze of a master upon an enslaved person. It carried none of the usual indifference or casual authority. It was something else entirely, a look of profound and private searching, as if Edmund were looking through Elias's face for something located just beyond it, something lost, something desperately needed. Elias learned to keep his own face empty when that gaze found him, eyes downcast, expression offering nothing back, a blank surface, a mirror showing only what the observer had brought with them. One Sunday, in the brief respite allowed, Elias found his way back to the quarters. He sat beside Abner outside the old man's cabin, the familiar smell of wood smoke and earth settling around him like something he hadn't known he'd missed. He said very little, but Abner, whose understanding ran fathoms deeper than most things visible, had already sensed the change in him. "Boy," Abner said, his voice a low and unhurried rumble, his knife carving slowly at a piece of pale wood in his hands. "You've been chosen for something." He let a long moment pass, and nothing that man chooses ever comes free of its price. Elias looked at him. "What do you mean, Abner?" Abner finally raised his eyes, ancient, steady, undeceived by anything. "That house isn't just brick and timber. It carries its own kind of hunger. And Master Hatcher, he's got his own kind of haunting." He returned his attention to his work. "You're in there now, Elias. You're not just serving that man. You're serving his secrets, and secrets, boy, they always carry a price." He said nothing further. The message had been delivered. Elias returned to the house that evening with Abner's words settling into his bones. He was not just a servant, he was a witness. He was not merely living inside the house, he was living inside its unspoken history. And the master's gaze, which had once merely unsettled him, now felt like something branding, marking him as a character in a story he had not yet been given the words to read. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday. Edmund Hatcher had ridden into town for a meeting with the county magistrate, a rare absence that left the house with a strange and unusual lightness, as if something heavy had temporarily lifted from the air. Elias was assigned to the study as usual, dusting the heavy mahogany desk, polishing brass fixtures, straightening the stacks of ledgers and correspondence into their proper order. The room, ordinarily so dense with the master's brooding presence, felt stripped bare without him, almost vulnerable. As Elias worked the surface of the desk with careful attention, his cloth snagged. He looked down. A small, ornate drawer, always kept locked, had been left barely ajar, a sliver of darkness revealed by Edmund's uncharacteristic haste. A tremor moved through Elias's entire body. He understood instinctively that this was a boundary he was never meant to cross. Yet the weight of every unanswered question, the unsettling gaze, the suffocating silence, Abner's warning, gathered behind him and pressed. He looked once towards the empty corridor. Nothing moved. He drew a long and shaking breath, and with trembling fingers opened the drawer. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed parchment, lay a small bundle of letters bound with a faded blue ribbon. They were not official documents, not business correspondence. These were personal, intimate things, their edges softened by years of handling and age. Elias carefully loosened the ribbon with fingers that would not quite be still. The letters were written in a flowing, graceful hand, the ink faded to pale brown. The dates: 1825, 1827, 1830, 1831. He began to read the first, his eyes moving quickly across the elegant script. It was addressed to my dearest Edmund. It was signed with a single initial, N. A cold wave passed through him from crown to floor. N. He knew that initial. He had encountered it before, etched into the surface of a small, smooth stone his mother had kept hidden among her few possessions. A stone she had held on certain evenings, with both hands pressed around it, her eyes somewhere distant. Nora, his mother. He read, and with each line, the world as he had understood it came apart at the seams. The letters spoke of a child, a secret child, conceived in a period of stolen moments and desperate hope. They spoke of promises Edmund had made, of protection, of a different kind of future. They spoke of a woman who understood, with a clarity that made the words on the page almost unbearable to read, that she would never leave this plantation alive, that her fate had been sealed by the very secret she carried. One letter, dated 1827, rose above the rest. Its words carved themselves permanently into Elias's memory. She had written of the child growing within her, a living testament to what had passed between them. She had written that Edmund had promised the child would be safe, that he would be given a life beyond the fields. But she could see clearly, she wrote, that Edmund's fear and shame would not allow him to honor that promise publicly. She knew her place. She knew what would become of her and of the child once the truth became a risk rather than a secret. And in her final lines, she pleaded, not for herself, but for the child, for the part of Edmund that lived within him. She prayed that if the truth ever found its way into the light, Edmund would not permit the child to suffer the fate that awaited his mother. Elias's hands shook so severely he nearly dropped. Ed the page. The child she carried, the promise made, the part of you that lives within him. Do not let him suffer the fate of his mother, Nora, and the child, him, Elias. He stood absolutely still in the silent study, the letter trembling between his fingers. The portrait above the fireplace, the woman with the luminous eyes, seemed to regard him from above with a sorrow that had waited a very long time to be witnessed. He looked at her now with different eyes and saw what he had never permitted himself to see, a resemblance, faint but unmistakable, to the face he carried in memory, the same quiet strength in the jaw, the same depth behind the eyes. He did not take the letters with him. He did not even consider it. With meticulous and deliberate care, he folded the letter he had read, returned it to its place among the others, and retied the ribbon exactly as he had found it. He pressed the drawer closed until he heard the soft click of its return. Then he finished the rest of his duties in the study, moving through the room automatically, his hands working while his mind processed what they contained. That night he did not sleep. He lay on his narrow cot, watching the sliver of moonlight that pressed through his high window and slowly, piece by piece, rebuilt his understanding of everything around him. Edmund Hatcher's gaze, that obsessive, searching attention, the inexplicable decision to bring him into the house, the silence that sat over Oakwood like a stone, all of it resolved now into a single coherent and devastating truth. He was not merely an enslaved man chosen for household service. He was a secret carried living into the home of the man who had made him, a breathing, moving testament to a broken promise and a buried sin. He was Edmund Hatcher's unacknowledged son, and the reason he had been brought into that house was not utility or kindness. It was something far more twisted, the need of a man who could not destroy his guilt and could not confess it either, and so had chosen instead to keep it close, to look at it each day in the face of the child he had never claimed and never would. The first shadow had fully fallen, and Elias understood, with the clarity of a man who has just seen through the floor of everything he thought was solid beneath him, that life in this house, for himself and for everyone within it, would never be what it had appeared to be again. The knowledge did not arrive in Elias as an explosion. It settled instead, cold and dense and immovable, into the pit of his stomach, radiating steadily outward until it had reached every part of him. He now moved through the house wearing a second set of eyes entirely. Edmund Hatcher's attentions, once merely unnerving, now had a name and a shape. This was not kindness. It was not the caprice of a powerful man. It was the compulsive need of someone who had wronged the dead and could not stop returning to the evidence of that wrong. Someone who needed to keep the proof of his failure close enough to look at, but never close enough to acknowledge. The entire architecture of Oakwood, its grand columns, its gleaming floors, its heavy draperies, no longer read to Elias as symbols of prosperity. They were the elaborate and costly construction of a lie. The silence that permeated every room was not simply the quiet of a well-managed household. It was the silence of complicity, the silence of people who knew or half knew and had made their separate calculations about the cost of speaking. Ruth confirmed it in fragments, in hushed, guarded exchanges in the pantry, in the laundry room, whenever they were briefly alone. She spoke of a time long before Elias's birth, when Nora had not been in the fields, when she had worked inside the house as a seamstress, when the master had taken what the master sometimes took. Her words were always veiled, always carefully chosen, but the weight beneath them was not. Mrs. Price, too, began to take on new significance. The way her eyes would sometimes catch on Elias and hold a moment longer than necessary. The deep, weary sigh that escaped her when Edmund withdrew into himself, or when Thomas sharpened his cruelties. She had been there, or near enough. She carried the knowledge in her posture, in the particular quality of her silences. Even Dr. Nathaniel Graves, the family physician, carried a detectable piece of the history. Elias observed the brief, almost subliminal glances exchanged between the doctor and Edmund on his visits, the kind of glances that move between two men who share a burden too large to reference directly. He noted the faint tightening of Graves's jaw when Nora's name arose accidentally in conversation, and Thomas, whose cruelty toward Elias had always felt strangely personal, strangely targeted, now made a chilling and complete sense. Thomas knew, or suspected, or feared. His hatred was not the casual contempt of a master for an enslaved man. It was the specific malice of a son who sees in someone else's face the proof of his father's most dangerous secret, and who understands, without being able to say so openly, that the man standing before him in the corridor has a claim on the Hatcher name that neither of them will ever be permitted to speak aloud. Clara, with her quiet sadness and her half-given gestures of acknowledgement, she too had known or felt the edges of the truth for years. Her unhappiness was not merely the condition of a woman constrained by the era she had been born into, it was the weight of a family secret she had inherited without being consulted, without being given any way to set it down. Elias walked through the house, performing his duties while all of this moved continuously through him. And then one evening Edmund summoned him to the study. The lamp burned low. The air was thick with whiskey and pipe tobacco. Edmund sat in his high-backed chair, a glass turning slowly in his hand, his face half in shadow. He did not look at Elias directly when he entered. His gaze was fixed on the fire. The silence stretched long between them. When Edmund finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, barely more than a murmur. He did not speak of the letters. He did not speak of Nora. He spoke around the truth, in the curved and indirect language of men who have spent decades learning to say everything except what they mean. "This land," Edmund began, his eyes still on the flames. "It is more than soil. It is a name. It is what a man leaves behind when everything else has gone." He paused and drank. "My father built this from nothing, and I have kept it. Added to it, a man owes something to what he has built, to his name, to his blood." His gaze shifted, not to Elias's eyes, but to his hands, the calloused, laboring hands of a man who had worked this same land for years. "There are obligations," Edmund continued, his voice fading further. "To the past, to order. Order must be maintained." Elias stood entirely still through all of it, absorbing every word, every silence between words. He understood what he was hearing. Edmund was not confessing. He was constructing a justification. He was reaching toward Elias across an uncrossable distance and asking, without words, to be understood, not forgiven, for the choices he had made. He was acknowledging his son's existence in the only language he had ever allowed himself, the language of abstract obligation, of legacy, of order, a language that could hold the meaning without ever quite releasing it into the open air. When Edmund finally dismissed him with a heavy wave, Elias turned and walked out of the study. The heavy oak door closed softly behind him. Something between them had shifted, permanently and without resolution. An acknowledgement without admission, a recognition without name. The silence that had once been a wall had become instead a shared room, small and airless and terrible, in which both men were now enclosed together. Elias walked the narrow corridor back to his small room at the rear of the house and understood with absolute clarity what Abner had known from the beginning. He was living inside Edmund Hatcher's conscience, and that was a place with no door, no window, and no way out that either of them could see. The months that followed the evening in the study proved the most dangerous Elias had yet endured. The fragile, unspoken understanding reached between himself and Edmund seemed only to intensify the pressure already building around them, particularly in Thomas. The house, which had always been under strain from its hidden weight, now began to show its fractures openly. Thomas grew bolder. His accusations became sharper, his campaigns more deliberate. A silver spoon would go missing. He would name Elias. A ledger would be misplaced. He would name Elias. The accusations were lies, and everyone who heard them knew it. But Thomas understood that in a world built on the authority of white men over enslaved ones, the lie did not need to be believed. It only needed to be repeated often enough to create an atmosphere of suspicion. His goal was transparent: to have Elias removed, sent back to the fields, sold away, erased from the house and from whatever unspoken arrangement had made him central to it. Edmund, however, continued to deflect every attack, a weary wave of the hand, a dismissal so quiet it carried more authority than any raised voice. He kept Elias close with a persistence that baffled Thomas and only deepened his fury. Dr. Graves's visits began to increase in frequency. Edmund's health, which had never been robust, seemed to be retreating, the gauntness more pronounced, the cough more present, the energy behind his eyes beginning to dim. During one of these visits, Elias was sent to bring fresh water to the study. The door stood slightly open, and fragments of the conversation reached him before he could withdraw. He heard Dr. Graves's voice, measured as always but pressed thin by an unusual urgency. "You cannot keep him here indefinitely, Edmund. It is not natural, and it is dangerous for everyone in this house." Edmund's reply was a low, blunt sound. "He stays." The implications. If word were ever to reach the wrong ears, if anyone were ever truly to piece it together, and Elias heard in the silence that followed the shape of everything that had been left unsaid, Edmund's voice returned, quieter. "I know the risks, Nathaniel. I have lived with them every morning of my life, but I cannot send him away." A long pause. "Not now." Elias withdrew from the door without making a sound. He carried those words back to his small room and turned them over and over in the dark. Dr. Graves had said it plainly, or nearly plainly. Edmund had made a conscious choice to keep the living evidence of his transgression within reach. Not to free him, not to name him, simply to keep him close, as a man might keep an open wound from healing, needing the pain as a form of penance he could not otherwise perform. It was, Elias now understood fully, a twisted and permanent kind of possession. Edmund Hatcher could not acknowledge his son. He could not release him. He could only keep him contained, close, visible, and unspeakable within the walls of the house built on lies, for whatever time remained to either of them. And Black Right Stories will continue, bringing you the voices and histories that were never meant to be heard. If you are still with us, leave a comment and let us know. Like this story and share it with someone who deserves to know what the silence was really made of.